Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Louisa May Alcott's Little Women has been a favorite of mine since I was a young girl, a book I read at least once a year for at least a decade and a half. Now I'm listening to it on audiobook with my husband, who definitely knows the outline of the story, but I'm not sure he's read the book before. Honestly, I'm not too keen on the narrator, who I think makes the text seem much more sentimental and saccharine than Alcott's actual writing does. Nevertheless, I'm loving hearing all my favorite scenes as I knit along on a very simple asymmetrical triangular shawl in garter stitch, a plain pattern, perfect for both traveling and for this little knit and listen. The plainness of the shawl suits me, and I think it suits the Alcott family as well. You'll see me wearing it around my shoulders sometime soon. I'll admit that David is not as taken with the book as I have always been. We are not terribly far into the tome, but he's finding it a bit preachy. Meanwhile, I think of it as a proto-feminist text full of serious but not overly preachy efforts to determine how to make one's life meaningful and how to make oneself kinder, more humane, more connected in a changing world. As an introvert, I love seeing the March girls learn to be introspective and self-analytical, while at the same time learning the great importance of action, that is, good deeds. They participate in making their family stronger, their community more welcoming and more inclusive, and the nation as a whole more just at a time when the United States was torn apart during the Civil War over the issue of slavery and over cultural issues that developed in the face of slavery. Well, in addition to listening to the audiobook of the actual novel, I've also been reading a variety of Alcott-adjacent books, all different from each other and all terrific ways to celebrate both the main Alcott read-along, Louisa May 2020, linked to below, and my personal extension project, All Things Alcott. I want to talk about 4 of these books. The nonfiction Meg, Jo, Beth, Amy, The Story of Little Women and Why It Still Matters by Annie Boyd Rioux, a collection of personal essays, March Sisters, on life, death, and Little Women by Kate Bolick, Jenny Zhang, Carmen Maria Machado, and Jane Smiley, a bio-memoir called Miss Alcott's Email, Yours for Reforms of All Kinds by Kit Bakke, and finally the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel March by Geraldine Brooks. The first Alcott-adjacent book I want to talk about is Anne Boyd Rieux's Meg, Jo, Beth, Amy, a fantastic work of literary analysis, women's history, and feminist thinking. This book blew me away. If you like Alcott enough to be watching this video, I highly recommend that you try to find a copy. I thought that since I was relatively familiar with Alcott's biography, I would skim over the biographical section, but I found myself taking my time, appreciating the thoughtful framing of her life, a framing that pulls out themes that aren't always talked about. Then, when I got to the chapter going through all the stage and film adaptations of Alcott's novel, I again thought I would skim through, since I thought I didn't really care about all the details of the differences of each production. Gosh, was I wrong! Rieux's discussion of how historical context affected various adaptations of the novel is really fantastic and utterly engrossing, not the catalog I was kind of expecting. And the latter parts of her book, where the author speaks in detail about how the book was feminist for its time, but also feminist for today, is just spectacular, creative and persuasive at the same time. And then comes some brilliant discussions of the fact that this book is the subject of a lot of scholarship, but that it's rarely taught, and why that's true is also really interesting. Really, don't miss this excellent volume. I'm really hoping that the author will release a new edition of this study now that there are a few new film adaptations, including the brand new one. I'd also love to see a section discussing all the new retellings coming out in print. The next book I want to talk about is March Sisters, on life, death, and Little Women. As it says in the introduction, Little Women is the kind of book in which readers find themselves. The essays in this book recount how each author identifies in some way with one of the characters in Little Women. At least for those of us who grew up wanting to be writers and who grew up with less than completely traditional ideas about the role of women, Jo is the obvious character with whom to identify. But these authors consider the ways in which the other sisters mirror parts of ourselves as well. Kate Bolick considers Meg, acknowledging that she seems like a conventional literary heroine with her kindness, her gentleness, her responsibility. That is her status as a maternal figure. But the author recognizes in herself and in Meg what Virginia Woolf called frock consciousness, the love of clothes and pretty things, despite her essential tomboy feminism, and her discomfort at being the object of other people's gaze. Bolick recognizes that clothing can make a new woman, that is, as she writes, having a double consciousness, passing as someone she's not. She's free to assume behavior she never would have otherwise. Bolick recognizes that Meg's experience in the Vanity Fair chapter, when she gets all dressed up, is sort of a failure. But it doesn't change the main point that Louisa May Alcott's book functions in some of the same ways that Meg's silly dress does. It gives readers an opportunity to try on different potential selves. As much as we might think it when we're young, we are not one character or another character. Each of us is all of the sisters at various times, and even all of the sisters at once, as well as Marmee and Aunt March and Hannah and Laurie and the others. As the author says, books enlarge us. And as Walt Whitman might continue, we contain multitudes. The essay on Jo is equally wonderful, talking about not only proper gender roles and immigration, but rage, solitude, and how to be the protagonist of your own story. The essay on Beth addresses issues of disability and illness in interesting ways. Instead of writing about being the protagonist of your own story, the author emphasizes how important it is to keep yourself from being defined by other people's stories. Personally, I found Jane Smiley's essay about Amy to be by far the weakest in the book. Clearly, she imagines herself more in a Marmee role than she does as Amy. Repeatedly, she inserts herself as the perfect contemporary mother. Let me read you a passage, only one of several written by Smiley that made me groan. After talking about Amy burning Jo's book and then falling through the ice, she writes, "If these were my daughters, I would have postponed my conversation with Jo, spent time with Amy, comforting her and watching her for evidence of PTSD, brought them together for a conversation about both the burned manuscript and what Jo has done, and then explained very clearly to both of them that they must learn to control their tempers. I would have given them some advice. Take a few deep breaths before you speak. Walk away if you can't control yourself. Have a conversation, not a fight, and come to me with a complaint so I can help you negotiate." Please, honestly, this is the kind of preachy, top-down text that would have appeared in pre-Little Women fiction designed for young people. What Alcott gives us is a Marmee deeply invested in her children and always there for them when they approach her. But she also, in general, stays out of their way and lets them figure out how to grow up with a feeling of liberty and self-determination. Smiley recognizes that, quote, "As usual, she learns her lesson on her own, and the lesson is that if anyone is going to take care of her, it must be herself." Rather than seeing that as one of the reasons the book has lasted so long amongst young readers, Smiley sees it as a great fault. I'm not disputing that Smiley could be a great mother in real life, but she'd be a terrible mother in a children's novel. Anyway, the book as a whole is short and fairly thoughtful overall. A book I've just barely started at this point, but am really enjoying, is Kit Bakke's Miss Alcott's Email, Yours for Reforms of All Kind. This book seems to be a really fascinating combination of memoir, history of two different time periods, and biography. The author, Kit Bakke, was a social justice activist in the 1960s and 70s, working for the Students for Democratic Society, and then the more radical group, the Weathermen. She doesn't abandon her politics. But she moves out of the organization to be a wife, a mother, and a nurse, working in this different way for a better society. It makes sense that she would see Alcott as her sister-in-arms, a woman who worked 100 years earlier for abolitionist causes, for women's right to vote, etc., and yet also cared about creating a better society via family and via nursing. The author sends Alcott an email asking for advice about how she and her friends should build their futures. And to her surprise, she tells us, she receives a response. The two women started a dialogue. Let me quote, "Together, Louisa and I devised a mutually agreeable project. I would read everything I could find about or by her. I would then write short histories about all the interesting things she had done, the argumentative and creative people she had known, and how she had made her life work. I would send them to her for her correction and comment. In return for her editorial efforts, Louisa would have a chance to speak out one more time, and she could learn the 21st century fate of her own most heartfelt causes." The author explains that she does not exactly know how the technology worked, but she sent her notes and chapter outlines to Louisa May Alcott digitally, and Alcott receives them, as Bakke laughs, in neat and extremely legible handwriting, unlike her own. Alcott used worn ink pens and paper for her return notes, but they showed up in Bakke's inbox as Times New Roman. Each chapter of the book starts with a letter from Bakke to Alcott, and then presents Bakke's short essay, and then Alcott's response. What fun, and I'm very much looking forward to finishing the book. Finally, let me talk about Geraldine Brooks' wonderful novel March, primarily an imagining of how the Little Women's father expressed his time away from his family during the years of the Civil War. Actually, the character is a mix of Alcott's Mr. March and her real father, Bronson Alcott. Most of the novel is told in first person by Brooks' version of Mr. March, as he struggles through not only the complexity of supporting an end to slavery, while also remaining a pacifist in the midst of war, a war that sometimes seems especially unjust to him. If war can ever be said to be just, then this war is so, he states. It is action for a moral cause, with the most rigorous of intellectual underpinnings. But then March hesitates, and yet everywhere I turn I see injustice done in the waging of it. At the heart of the book is the theme of secrecy and hiddenness in order to protect the feelings and sentiments of other people. As Mr. March writes, every day as I turn to what would be the happy obligation of opening my mind to my wife, I grope in vain for words with which to convey to her even a part of what I have witnessed, what I have felt. He admits that he hides more than just the horrors he sees around him. As for what I have done and the consequences of my actions, these I do not even attempt to convey. As readers, we do see what he chooses to hide from Marmee and the girls, and why. We also see how devastating the secrecy is to his sense of connection with his family, and to his wife's connection to him. Secrets and lies, not the actual things that were hidden, do the real damage in this book. One of my favorite scenes in Brooks's novel is a direct response to a line from Little Women that isn't completely developed in Alcott's book. As I've been listening to Little Women lately, I've been struck with my identification with Marmee far more than I ever had felt before. The line of hers I find so powerful is when she says she's angry every day of her life, even though the girls see only her love and patience. In Brooks's novel, Mr. March explains the backstory of how Marmee learned to tame her anger, although not completely contain it. In one marital argument, he recalls, Marmee yelled at him, "You stifle me, you crush me, you preach emancipation, and yet you enslave me in the most fundamental way. You call our girls your little women. Well, I am your belittled woman, and I am tired of it. I will not be degraded in this way." The two continue to argue, with Mr. March claiming that he stayed calm while Mrs. March threw a clod of dirt at him. Eventually, he hands her a switch from a weeping birch tree and tells her to hit him with it. She does, whipping it through the air and thrashing his cheek. As soon as Marmee sees what she's done, she's horrified, weeping and kissing her husband. It might have been one of the children I struck, she realized. Mr. March acknowledges that this is the moment of shock and self-awareness which leads Marmee to a greater degree of self-control than she's exercised previously. I want to mention one brief thing from the end of the novel that is not exactly a spoiler, but which does suggest a bit of how the plot proceeds. If you'd like to avoid this, feel free to stop watching now. Over the course of the novel, Mr. March has come to know an enslaved woman named Grace, a character whose action at the end of the book is a rejection of some of Mr. March's paternalistic ideas about his role as an abolitionist. What she says to him at that moment is hard for him to accept. He is hurt by her rejection of his desire to stay on as a preacher or even a hospital orderly for formerly enslaved people. As she tells him, "We have had enough of white people ordering our existence. There are men in my own race more versed in how to fetch and carry than you ever will be, and there are Negro preachers aplenty who know the true language of our souls. A free people must learn to manage its own destiny." As you might guess from her name, what she gives Mr. March at this point is a kind of grace, a new vision that gives his future a new purpose. As she says, if you sincerely want to help us, go back to Concord and work with your own people. Write sermons that will prepare your neighbors to accept a world where black and white may one day stand as equals. And she tells him to go to the people who actually need him most, his little women. I have to admit that as powerful as I find the scene, it sort of came out of the blue, almost out of character in a way. Perhaps that fact is the result of writing from a first-person perspective, when that person doesn't fully understand another character until the other person insists on her voice being heard. Although I don't think it is a perfect book, I highly recommend March, perhaps especially if you are a fan of Little Women. Although there are a lot of references to various moments from Alcott's book, it is definitely not essential to read Alcott before Geraldine Brooks. Her book stands alone just fine. Thanks for joining today for this long wrap-up of these Alcott-adjacent books. I'm looking forward to seeing you all soon here on Hannah's Books and across BookTube. Happy New Year.